conspiracies or something like that. The whole purpose was they have these problems they need to solve. So they use superstition in order to tie these antisocial practices, these things that like normally government would take care of, to these spiritual things so that people would enforce these rules themselves. Today we're going to go on to a few different topics. This one is going to focus on how the Christians in Europe tried to provide themselves a legal system. We typically hear of ordeals usually just as a joke, making fun of pre-modern people and how they let these superstitions rule their lives. But actually, these ordeals were an ingenious way for the not early Christians, like the 9th to 13th century Christians, to try to determine guilt or innocence. So today, when we try to catch criminals, we'll use DNA, fingerprints, cameras, cell phone records, social media, things like that to try to find suspects. So it's much more scientific. We're trying to build evidence and gather facts. We have a lot of tools today to make catching criminals a lot easier than it used to be in the past. So it's important for societies to catch criminals, to keep crime low, to keep society working well, so people can be safe and happy, and they can worry about more important things than just trying to be safe. They can make their lives even better. So if you're like a loser that watches Law & Order, like the original Law & Order, it started in 1990, ended in 2010, you can see how much technology changed over that 20-year period, to see just how much easier it became to catch criminals over time. But for a long time, it wasn't possible to do anything like that. Even the stuff from back in the early 90s that looked so much less advanced to us was leaps and bounds above what people used to be able to do in the past. So they needed to find some other methods. So for about 400 years in Europe, what they used to try to catch criminals was by asking the defendant to thrust their arm in a thing of boiling water, or to grab a burning hot iron, or they would throw them into a lake. And based on whether they sunk or float, or whether their arms were burned, would determine whether or not they were guilty. Now this may sound stupid and very barbaric, but again, this is actually an ingenious way to try to solve this problem. So first off, ordeals were not used in cases where it was fairly obvious. So if they had physical evidence for someone to be at the scene, which back then would be very difficult, or if there was a witness or several witnesses who saw them, if they had bragged about it before or afterwards, then they wouldn't need to use ordeals. But when there was not clear evidence, that's when they would use ordeals. So there's a quote that I included here. I forget who it's from, but it's from 1000 or 1100 AD. So let doubtful cases be determined by the judgment of God. The judges may decide that which they clearly know, but that which they cannot know shall be reserved for divine judgment. Now it's important to note, unlike today, religious and legal institutions were linked together. So the monarchs, say in England, there was widespread belief that they had the right to rule from God, the divine right of kings. The bishops and even local priests tended to provide a lot of government services that typically the government does today. Now they were able to use ordeals because of the medieval superstition or belief in, I spelled that wrong, Judicium Dei, or the judgment of God. Should be an I. And again, there were two types of ordeals, hot and cold ordeals. Hot ordeals, you put your arm in boiling water and pull out a stone or a ring, or you grab a burning hot piece of iron. Cold water ordeals, you're bound and thrown into a lake. Now, one thought, and something that societies had done before this, is to use torture, illicit confessions. The problem, as Danny DeVito finds out in It's Always Sunny, is that you can get inaccurate results from torture. He waterboards Dee in a urinal for a while, and he says, I got Dee to admit the things she never did. So it's very difficult to use torture if you actually want to find out who did it. If you just want someone to admit to doing it, then torture So what ordeals were was a way that they devised to separate the innocent from the guilty. And the innocent and the guilty would separate themselves. So even though it would seem like it comes from a custom of Dark Age ignorance, that it's very irrational, it actually had this useful purpose. So again, if there was like, I guess physical evidence, or if they admitted to it, or if there was a witness that saw them, they wouldn't have to go to ordeals. But when there was no witness or no evidence, there was no way to know who did it or to prove who did it, when someone was accused, they would use these ordeals to try to figure it out. So what they would do is get the guilty to confess, to deny like actually being willing to undergo the ordeal, and for the innocent to accept doing the ordeal. The reason why this worked is because there's different costs based on whether you're innocent or guilty. And remember, this, you have to believe in Iudicium Dei, or the judgment of God, for this to work. But if the people believe this, it works like a charm. So if you're guilty and you believe that the hand of God will come in and punish you or allow you to be punished, then you believe you're going to be harmed by the ordeal. You plunge your arm in that burning hot thing of water, or boiling hot, thing of water, you're going to get pretty bad burns. Then that's going to be evidence of your guilt, so you're going to be punished anyway. So you're getting hurt and punished. It's less costly for you just to confess to the crime and to suffer your punishment, so you're not getting burned. But if you're innocent and you believe in Iudicium Dei, then you will not be harmed because of God's intervention. So that means if you want to prove your innocence, and you are innocent, and you believe in this, you will be willing to undergo the ordeal. So you get the guilty to admit their guilt, and you get the innocent to signal how strongly they believe they're innocent. Can anyone think of a modern day analogy to this, where innocent people are willing to undergo something to show that they're innocent?
Say like a DNA test or a blood test, something like that.
Yeah, so if there's physical evidence, they say, oh, I know it wasn't me. Yeah, that's one example. It's the same sort of thing here, where they know they're innocent, and they know they can use this to prove it. So basically what ordeals do is incentivize people that are accused of these crimes to reveal their criminal status, whether or not they were innocent or guilty. Okay, so is there any proof of this? This is a fairly elaborate theory. It's, I don't know, I guess creative. That's what I first thought of when I heard of this. If we look at how the ordeals were administered, and then we look at the outcomes of ordeals from the records that still remain, we can see whether or not there's evidence that this worked as I just claimed it worked. I have some notes scribbled down somewhere, but I lost them for these next couple slides. All right, so one possible reason. Okay, so one problem with ordeals is that if you put your arm in boiling water, it's going to hurt. You grab a hot iron, it's going to burn you. If you're bound and thrown in water, a lot of people are going to sink. So if that's the case, then how did ordeals work? Because in our minds, the way you undergo the ordeal, if you go through it, seems like you're going to be declared guilty, like you're going to fail the ordeal. But how the medieval societies, how they needed this to work, was the opposite. They needed the people to undergo the ordeals to be exonerated, because it's the innocent that's going to be willing to do this. And we can see how this happened with the actual administration of the ordeals. So what happened with this is that the clerics, the priests that were doing the ordeals, had a lot of latitude for how they went about it. So the priests knew the local community members very well. Remember, these are like small villages. There's not a lot of people around. Everyone knows everyone. And the priest was one of the leaders of the community. And when the belief in the judgment of God is strong enough in the community, the equilibrium is that only the innocent are going to be willing to undergo the ordeals. Now, the priests would know this, and the priests can fix the ordeals, design it in such a way that the innocent defendant is left unharmed. Even though we think that they would get hurt from the ordeal, like automatically, they can design it, they can arrange it so that isn't what happened. So there's a long quote here from, I don't know, back in like the 1100s, describing how ordeals happened. So what they would do is they would have a mass, and they would do the ordeal at the very end of mass. So they would, for the hot water ordeal, or the hot ordeals, they would they would build a fire, and then it would just be the priest and the person who was supposed to undergo the judgment at this point. Then you would have, kind of like a jury. You would have third parties come in and line up along the sides of the church. Not near the front, not like in the pews up there, but along the side. So they're pretty far back. They don't have a great view of the fire. And the fire isn't to be tended after those people come in to witness the Mass. If anyone's Catholic in here, you know that Masses can go on for a very long time depending on the priest you have. So the priests had as much latitude to lengthen the Mass or shorten the Mass as they wanted to. Then the accused would drink of holy water and then have their hand or the iron be sprinkled with holy water. And then they would do the ordeal. Now you can imagine the priest would be perfectly fine with giving themselves the latitude of putting extra water on the hot iron or on the person's hand to reduce the amount of heat that's going to burn their skin. Additionally, it would be, 3 days later that they would unbandage the person's hand, and then it would be the priest alone who would determine whether or not that counted as an injury. So even if, the fire lasted too long, the iron ended up being too hot compared to what the priest wanted, he didn't sprinkle enough water on the person's hand, so it ended up being burned. He alone looks at it and determines whether or not that burn is enough to count as God stepping in and helping that person. Now I should note, because this is a Catholic school, I'm a Catholic myself, Catholic doctrine is not inconsistent with the priest being able to do this. When the priest engages in sacraments, they're acting, they say, in persona Christi, or in the person of Christ. So they have a lot of latitude to make their own judgments in these cases. So it is consistent with Catholic law for priests who have actually done this. Oh yeah, and this is just breaks down everything in that very long quote. Anything I missed? No, basically everything I just said. Now there's also cold water ordeals. Now it seems like cold water ordeals people would just guarantee these things, especially because they're being bound. So priests, and it'd be very difficult to manipulate a cold water ordeal. It's very obvious if someone sinks or floats. But they can manipulate the outcome of cold water ordeals by changing who they sent to the ordeals. So on average, men have a lower body fat percentage than women. So if you tossed an average lean male into water, they'd have an 80% chance of sinking. The average lean woman would have a 40% chance of sinking. So odds are they would float. The water would reject them, a sign of guilt. So if cold water ordeals were used for men, they could exonerate most of the people who underwent them. And it's fairly easy to tell whether someone is lean or not, whether they're likely to have a high body fat percentage and float, or whether they don't. So that's how they manipulated the cold ordeals, by changing who they sent to them. So, do we have any proof? There's 3 sets of records that are pretty decent remaining from when ordeals were in use in the Middle Ages. First is from the Basilica Negavarad probably butchering that, from 1208 to 1235 AD, there were 208 cases of ordeals during this time, when there was not enough evidence for the trial to be determined through the normal legal system. 130 probans, the name for the accused individuals, were declared innocent at 62.5%. So something's going on there. Either 2/3 of priests don't understand how to heat iron, or there was some sort of rigging going on. And that's what we would expect if the priests were using this as a way to separate the innocent from the guilty. That they know there's a lot of people that are innocent, that are willing to undergo this ordeals to prove their innocence. So they sprinkle extra holy water on the iron, or they declare a burn that really was a burn, not a burn. Or it could be evidence of the judgment of God actually stepping in here. There are a few records from the plea rules from the English royal court in the late 11, early 1200s. 17 of 19 people who underwent the ordeals passed them. They were declared innocent. Again, this should not happen unless the priests are manipulating it or God truly does have a hand in this. And finally, the English IRA rolls from about the same time. There were 84 men and 7 women. This is the only of the 3 that has women in it. 79 men were sent to cold water ordeals, so almost all of them. All 7 women were sent to hot water ordeals, where they were much more likely to pass. And there were 3 cases where a man and a woman were jointly accused of a crime. Oh no, I don't have those notes written down. Okay, so I think 2 of them, they were accused together as accomplices. One, the man was accused, then the woman was accused, after the man was found innocent. In all 3 cases, the man was sent to the cold water ordeal, and the woman was sent to the warm water ordeal. So we have evidence that they're manipulating this based off of who they're sending to the cold water ordeal. Now, ordeals were so great, if they worked so well for 400 years, why did they stop being used? What happened to do it? Well, first of all, it requires faith in the judgment of God. You need an active God who's going to step in there and solve it. It needs to be tied to this, this religious belief. It's important to note that any Jewish people that were accused of crimes were not required to undergo ordeals. They were not allowed to undergo ordeals. They would have to use swearing oaths and other methods. The reason being, they didn't believe in Eudicea Dei like the Christians did. So for them, you wouldn't get the separating equilibrium. A guilty person who thinks it's BS and an innocent person who thinks it's BS, both would not be willing to undergo that. They think, well, I'm just going to get burned. So you need to have this belief in God. So if the church withdrew their support, if they said you're not allowed to do this, then it would affect people's reliance on ordeals. And that's exactly what happened. So in the Fourth Lateran Council in AD 1215, the church banned the use of ordeals. There was some controversy for maybe 100 years leading up to this in the church, whether or not it was actually appropriate to do this, whether it had support from the Bible and things like that. It took about 5 years, but most of Europe banned ordeals after that. Most of the local churches and like the dioceses refused to allow ordeals to continue. Denmark prohibited them in 1216, England in 1219, Scotland by 1230. Italy ended it in 1231 officially, but a ton of towns and areas had already banned it well before that. France never formally abolished the ordeals. They never said, like, you can't do this anymore. But the last one that was used that we have record of is 1218, the last time it was mentioned. They don't have the record of the actual, whether they're guilty or innocent, things like that. So without this superstition, this supernatural belief tied to the ordeals, it became worthless. People were not willing to use it. The innocent didn't think they would be protected, so they couldn't use it to demonstrate their innocence. And just as some evidence to show that that it was the belief in the supernatural that's required for ordeals to work. Trial by combat was also banned by the Fourth Lateran Council. Trial by combat in Norman England, because they're descended from Vikings and they're warriors, if you had a dispute with someone, you could fight them. Over time, it got more and more advanced, and you could actually hire a professional fighter to fight for you. If you or your fighter won, then you won the court case. So instead of going to Judge Judy, you went out back and you brawled over it. Now, trial by combat did not require belief in God or in God's judgment, or is willing to step in during this judgment process. And it continued in Norman England for several centuries. There was a funny newspaper article, been a while now, probably from 10 years ago, where some old guy got a traffic ticket, and he declared it was his right to challenge the police officer to trial by combat to see if he could get off. I don't know if he was serious or it was just like a joke. Because the British government has been around so long, they have all these old laws that they haven't technically gotten rid of. So every now and then you have people trying to do this kind of stuff. Interestingly, before William the Conqueror conquered England, the old city of London had, now I forget how they did this, but had declared themselves separate from the Anglo-Saxon rulers at the time. So any king that came through had to disarm if you actually went into London, and needed to ask permission from the London government if they could go into London. And that stuck around after the Norman invasion. So to this day, if the Queen of England wants to go into London, has to ask permission. Which I think is wild that this happened from what? Norman invasion was it was the thousands AD. So this is from 900 AD. Anyway, that was just a weird aside. So there's another contemporary analog to ordeals, and that's the polygraph test. So there's no real way to physiologically measure the truthfulness of a person. They try to measure your heart rate to see if your heart rate's spiking. That means you're lying. But who wouldn't be nervous when they're tied up to a machine being accused of a crime? But here's the thing: if people believe in not ordeals, they believe in polygraphs, that polygraphs can accurately separate the innocent from the guilty. Again, they're going to be willing to undergo them to signify their innocence. If they're guilty, they'll only be willing to do it if they think they can beat it. Because most people believe in polygraphs, if they're accused of crimes, if they're involved in that, they're willing to undergo the polygraph test. When you're applying for government jobs or clearances, they'll give you a polygraph test. One of the first questions they ask you is, do you believe in the efficacy of polygraph tests? Really formally focusing on that separating equilibrium, trying to determine if the person believes in it or not. See, we're far more advanced than those in the Middle Ages. Instead of using hot irons, we just use squiggly lines on a piece of paper. But it's basically the same thing. And honestly, even though it doesn't truly work, I still think it's very clever that we're using now science instead of spirituality. But it's the same thing. Because people believe in this, it can separate the innocent from the guilty. So it incentivizes the innocent to show off their innocence and the guilty to admit to their guilt. We talked about this in Pete Leeson's class. He made fun of polygraphs for 45 minutes. And then he ended with, superstition is like Jello. There's always room for more. No matter how advanced you think a society is, there's always some measure of superstition. It may be about something that seems very advanced, but typically, there's going to be some superstition somewhere left in society. You guys have any questions about ordeals? On the final, there will be a question about gypsies, and there will be a question about ordeals. Just a very basic one to say, hey, this seems weird. What the hell's actually going on here? You don't need to go through all the records, know the numbers, or go through the exact process. But the basic idea of that is separates the innocent from the guilty, if people believe in it. All right, next let's move on to vermin trials. hopefully we can hit one more topic after this. It is fun getting to make fun of some of the weird stuff that Europe used to do. For 250 years in Europe, they would place insects and rodents on trial if they were accused of committing property crimes. And they were tried as legal persons. With some of the best legal minds on the continent serving as the defense attorneys. This happened in ecclesiastical courts all across Europe, especially in France, Italy, Switzerland, and some regions of Germany. But it did happen even more widespread. And they used the same laws and all the same legal procedures as they used to try actual persons. When you watch a court case today, you see, the defendant sitting there. You have the rules of evidence. You have the two attorneys facing off against each other. It would be as if we were putting rats on trial or weevils on trial using the same exact method. And this lasted, again, 250 years. So this is a long time. It's not like something someone made up with once as like a prank. It's something that continued and persisted and was fairly common. And this wasn't backwater Europe in the Dark Ages. So this wasn't as early as Ordeals. This came after Ordeals. So this is when Europe was, rediscovering literature and science, reading ancient Greek and Roman stuff for the first time in, centuries. I think I mentioned here a couple weeks ago that at one point in like the 900s, less than 10 people in Europe knew how to do long division. Wasn't a lot of great scholarship happening in the Dark Ages. But afterwards, during the Renaissance, we saw Europe begin to catch up with places like China or the Middle East, where people were actually learning things and building up knowledge over time. Yet, while this is occurring, they were putting animals on trial. And you can't blame it on people going crazy from untreated syphilis, which was a serious problem in Europe later. This is before they had gone to the New World and brought syphilis back. Kind of hard to see with the light shining down on the screen for that picture there, but that's Jack McCoy showing off evidence to a defendant in an episode of Law and Order. Imagine Jack McCoy, if you like that show, or if you like a different legal procedural show. That, awesome attorney placing rats on trial and talking to the rats. So these are used from the 1400s to the 1600s, the golden age of vermin trials. During this time, if there were citizens who had trouble with pest control, what they would do is use a class action lawsuit to sue vermin in these ecclesiastical courts, so courts that were associated with the Catholic Church. Now, there was pretty much no knowledge about how to get rid of pests back then. There were no advancements in Europe from the classical period, so from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They thought you would, there were a bunch of weird things that came down from the Romans. There's one that involved sprinkling cat urine over the field. There was one that was sprinkling the dust from some pest that you caught, sprinkling that over the field. One fairly common thing they used to do is if you had rats, cut the head off one of the rats you catch and hang them up around your field to serve as a warning so they don't come back. Because they thought that would work. And in the official how-to manuals to get rid of pests, one of the things was go to the church, go to the ecclesiastical court, and have God send them out from your land, from your area. And there's widespread belief that the church could drive away demons. Drive away demons, and that could drive away animals. So plaintiffs would go to court and initiate legal action against these vermin. So they would go to the church who ran the court to do this. Now, back then, most people didn't pay taxes to the government. If your area was still feudal, you would pay, like, you were a serf, you'd pay, the crops you owed to your, like, the lord of the manor. And you would also tithe to the Catholic Church. So 10% of all the crops that you grew, you would give to the church. 10% is a decent amount, especially for someone who doesn't have much. So that could be fairly difficult for a person to actually give. So a lot of times, like people nowadays, like that picture I showed you of the person that built their house over a creek on a bridge to avoid paying taxes on the town on either side, people try to minimize their tax exposure to the tithe. What some did was eat different crops were taxed at different rates. So they would take the crop that was taxed at a low rate, plant that all around the outside of the field, and then fill the inside with one that was taxed at a higher rate. The person coming by to look at their fields would see the outside and say, okay, you're taxed at, say, 8%. On the inside, they have all the thing that's taxed at like 10, 12%. They would do that to try to save money. Anything in their garden, like a personal garden, was not tithed. So they would have huge gardens with a ton of, instead of just like flowers and stuff in there, with food in there that they would eat. Sometimes people would outright try to hide the food. Now the church, this is their main source of income. I think it was something like 2/3 in France at the time of their income was just from the tithes. So like any government trying to maximize their tax revenue, they did not want people to withhold their tithes. One thing they could claim was, oh, the pests are really bad this year. So what these vermin trials were set out to do was to make sure that people weren't lying about the pests. So the person would have a formal statement of their complaint when they came to the ecclesiastic court. And they would deliver the statement before the court, like, very, very formally. And the court would exercise the bishop's jurisdiction over the community. So it would be for the entire, diocese. Those are pretty comparable to modern district attorneys who, they oversee a pretty decent-sized area and all of the supposed crimes that are existing in this area. So if the court saw merit in the complaint, if they thought there was, or if it seemed like from the person's complaint there was good evidence that they were attacked by some sort of rodent or vermin, whether it be flies, which is one of the things, whether it be rats, locusts, anything like that. The first thing they would do is tell the plaintiff to publicly pray. Go out in public and please pray that these leave. They could hold processions, so more formal religious things, for the removal of these vermin. They would then direct the plaintiffs to display what they call extra religiosity. So they would ask them to repent their sins, do these kind of things publicly. Then they would ask them to pay their tithes. They would warn them that before any of these things could work, you have to fully pay your tithes. You have to follow, God's rule and give that money to the church. If the pest did not leave after the first couple things, what the ecclesiastic courts would do is appoint defense attorneys to the accused pests. And one of the quotes from the paper on this is, ecclesiastic judges showed impressive fairness towards vermin in such trials. In Mainz, Germany, during a trial against some flies, they refused to appear, were unable to appear. So the judge appointed someone else to stand for them. So they had a witness, or not witness, someone to represent them in their place, along with their attorney who represented them. Now the attorney would go out when they were called in, like those flies. They would go out to the field. They would nail up some, whatever they would call their version of court summons, saying you need to come to the court on this day at this location. The attorney would go around calling out to whatever rodents, telling them to come into church or come into the ecclesiastic court. And this all sounds very silly that they were actually doing this. I'm going to mess up this name, but Bartholomew Chassenet was one of the leading jurists, one of the leading legal minds of the era in Europe. He defended vermin several times. Actually got fame for one of his cases defending the vermin. And they would argue strenuously for their clients. They would file a ton of motions to delay the proceedings as long as possible. The attorneys on both sides took their job very seriously. They spent a lot of time, knowledge, and legal expertise to defend their clients. Like I mentioned, the tithe was the church's taxes on their citizens. They used this in order to get most of the money they had during the Renaissance. But the enforcement of tithes are difficult. So the civil governments accepted the church's authority to tithe. They were fine with them taking that money, or I guess those crops, from people, from the people under the rule of the government. Sometimes they allowed the church to use state resources to obtain payments. So they would send out like the government's tax collectors to do that. But other times the church relied on their own mechanism, which was these court cases. Yeah, you can easily tell if someone refuses to pay any of their tithe, but if they underpay, this was much more difficult. So they needed to develop some sort of belief system. Give them some sort of a display of God's power to convince them or to force them to pay their tithes. Yeah, something you note in the book, Seeing Like a State, one of the main theses of that book is that government designs their systems to be as easy to enforce as possible. So they design their tax system to be as easy to enforce as possible, but there's still going to be problems with it. There's natural variation between the plots year to year. Sometimes they'd be a little bigger, sometimes a little smaller, based on like the planting season, and I don't know, if there's water nearby, they wash up, so maybe it gets bigger this year, maybe it washes some out because of flood, it gets smaller. Obviously, you're going to have different weather from year to year, so that's going to impact your crop yields. So small-scale invasion is very difficult to tell ahead of time. And people had what they call the 1,001 ruses. So there were all these different methods to try to cheat just a little bit, keep a little bit extra food for yourself. But those could really add up. So the punishment for evading your tithes could range from a simple sin that you can confess and be fine with to outright excommunication. There were several levels of excommunication. I don't know if we have time to really get into this. It's really that important. But basically, you're severed from the church or from God. Very difficult or impossible to get into heaven after being excommunicated, according to the church's rules. So the church could use these supernatural punishments for tithe evaders. But if someone's just underpaying slightly, it's much easier to do something to convince them to pay and have them pay for the rest of their lives versus just having them kicked out of the church, never getting that money ever again. So what Vermin trials was an attempt to provide evidence that these supernatural punishments existed. If they could show people that may not have been paying their tithes, may have been keeping some back, may have been underpaying, that claimed it was Vermin's doing it, if they could show them that, this God will cast out the vermin, and your land will be, it will produce a lot of crops again, then people will be more likely to pay. So they would gather evidence about the harvest for the plaintiffs, so they would look at the fields very in depth to see if it was likely that they had this problem with pests, whether there was something going on making them grow less than normal, whether it looked like they were hiding. And again, at every single step of the way, they were reminded and encouraged to pay their tithe. Yeah, and the displays of extra religiosity, I mentioned a couple slides ago, payment of due tithes was included in that pretty much every time. So again, you're constantly being told to pay your tithes, before the church would be willing to take care of this. So one of the things that determines people's willingness to pay tithes is their belief in ecclesiastical supernatural power. So if they believe that this would work, if they believe excommunications would truly sever you from the afterlife, if they believe that sin would remove you from God and, or have him give you less grace, things like that, then they would be much more willing to pay the tithes than if they didn't believe or didn't believe very strongly. So the purpose of Vermin trials were to convince members of the church's supernatural power. So if the pests, they fled or if they died, it was evidence that the church had these powers, and it would incentivize people to pay. Hey, look at this. God's actually, we can see his works in the world. We have strong evidence of this. I believe in him more now. What they would try to do is time the trials or stretch out the trials so the pests were likely to leave. So that way it would appear that the pest or the church was responsible for them leaving. So over time, the longer from when you first see the pest, the more likely it is they'll leave. The day you see them, it's unlikely they're going to leave. Well, 2 months, 4 months, 8 months later, odds are they're going to move on to somewhere else. So if you could time the trial right, so it lasts long enough that the pests are likely to leave, but short enough, it's not going on 6 years. Obviously, if it takes 6 years, the pests are going to move on their own. So it needs to be short enough that it can be evidence of God doing something, but long enough that it's guaranteed to work. So that's why we had these legal minds providing the defense of pests, filing all these motions, taking all this time for the trials to go through. I mean, they were working really hard. It's not like they were just mailing it in. And the reason was so that the church would appear to have the authority and the ability to drive out these pests. Now, the theory predicts not only that the trials will take a long time, and they do take a long time, or did take a long time, but the trials will often also occur where belief in the church is waning. So that's where heretics are popular and where the Protestant Reformation first crops up. In those regions where people believe in the power of the church less, whether it's because they just think the hierarchy is corrupt, or whether they believe that the church doctrine is actually wrong. Either of these can be why. So what the economists who looked at the Vermin trials did was look at witchcraft trials and this group called I can't pronounce anything in French for the life of me, Vaudois, okay, where those trials were, and matched them up with Vermin trials. In those areas where this Vaudois heresy was taking place, which basically was like each individual person should have a relationship with God, it's not determined by the hierarchy of the church. So very, very similar to most Protestant religions today. And witchcraft trials, which commonly occurred in the same places where we saw small heresies break out. We would expect that belief in the church would be weaker in those areas. So they would need to demonstrate the power of the church through Vermin trials. Use these to provide evidence to people who live there that, hey, the church can solve your problems and God is extremely powerful, so you should be nice to him and follow his rules. So the trials should occur in the regions where these happen and in the time period when they're happening or right after the heretical activity is happening. And that's basically what we see with these two charts here. So these little shaded areas are areas where we saw a lot of witchcraft trials and a lot of that heresy taking place. And the dots we see here, these are where we saw the Vermin trials. So we tend to see them in where there's heresy going on. We also see some stuff going on over here, a couple Vermin trials out there. Anywhere where people don't want to pay their tithes but are forced to, you're going to have some people giving away. So we should expect to see at least some. But the larger the size of the dot, the more Vermin trials we have record of. And we have the most Vermin trial activity here, where all these heresies and witch trials are taking place. And we see generally over time, it's not perfect, but where we see witch trials in the dotted line, not long afterwards we see these Vermin trials. Basically where there's a lot of accusations of witchcraft, of people practicing spiritual beliefs that don't align with the church, we see a weakening of the community's belief in the church, a lower willingness to pay tithes, and the need to engage in these Vermin trials to show the power of God, the power of the church. Yeah, something I talked about last year. I saw this funny headline that they were using ghosts in Indonesia to scare people away from the coronavirus. They're saying, don't go out at night. Basically, there's ghosts out there. The reason why this was able to work, or the reason why they had to do this, was because, almost perfect timing, was because there's a widespread belief in these ghosts in Indonesia. Also, their law enforcement and their legal system was not able to, do a lockdown well enough. We had the shelter-in-place orders for a couple weeks, and then we had a ton of businesses closed. They didn't have the state capacity, the government didn't have the ability to enforce a lockdown like that. So they just leveraged a superstition that was very common in order to discourage people from going out. And at least for a time, it worked. All right, that's about perfect timing. We weren't able to get into soccer hooligans, unfortunately. Basically, soccer hooligans are a fight club. People would use professional soccer in England to organize where to meet for fights, and then the hooligans would go there and fight each other. They had very strict rules, and they would use the reputation of different groups who would all dress very different. They would signify who they were through the dress, through where they would sit, the games, the bars they would go to. And if they were too violent, if they brought weapons or things that would really actually hurt people instead of just letting them brawl and have some fun, they would ostracize them, like the gypsies were unable to do, and you'd basically be kicked out of the fight club. Okay, so with that, we've got like 15 minutes left. So we'll hit the study guide for the final exam. Before we do, I'll just give you some information about the final. 25 multiple choice questions, 7 short answers, and some extra credits. This is basically the length of a normal exam. So I'd encourage you to take your time, because it looks bad for me if I let all you guys leave super early. I'm not saying you have to stay here the whole time. I'm just saying, don't rush through it, because it's going to take like a normal exam. So the study guide is going to focus on oligopoly, or the exam, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, and a couple of these random topics at the end. And then a few things from earlier in the semester. Anything from earlier in the semester is written word for word on here. Not even a hint, I'm just straight up telling you. So you know exactly what to study from this older stuff, rather than have to dig through your notes for the next 2 days. Yeah.
What chapters is that in the book on oligopoly?
I think 13 and 14, but I'll double check. Yeah, 13 is monopolistic competition, or no, it's oligopoly. Yeah, so 13 and 14. That's 14 and 13. Yeah. It is Thursday morning, 8 a.m. in this room. Yeah, this Thursday. So it's like the first one. I know this has been a long semester for everyone. It's been long for me. I could tell from you guys. Everyone has looked dead for the past month and a half. It's been really rough this semester for all of us. So I'm obviously not going to be an asshole about this final. We're all in this together. We're all just trying to make it through. And this is not OChem. This is not a weed out class. I'm not telling you not to study. Please, at least a little bit of studying. But I know I would get real nervous for finals. I couldn't imagine trying to do it this semester when you were fucking drained and you also have to kick it into high gear for the very end. So I just want to say I understand that. I know we have an idea of what you guys are going through, so I don't want to be terrible. So I cut it down. Normally I do like 15 short answers because we're supposed to fill up like the entire like 2-hour thing. I cut it down to 7 because you guys need some sanity. Are there any specific questions about this that you've looked at so far that you have about?
The one table, what is the marginal revenue of the third unit? Yeah, that one.
So marginal revenue of the third unit is going from unit 2 to unit 3. What's the change in revenue? Our marginal revenue is just the change for the next unit.
Okay.
So it's going to be a difference between $19.50 and $14 to $5.50. That's one of those questions where you're getting it's basically just simple math,
Yeah.
but you have to be able to apply the idea of marginal revenue. It's not exactly like explicitly laid out for you.
The one that says, what is the four-firm concentration ratio and what is the drawback?
Okay, so the 4-firm concentration ratio is just the percentage of sales in an industry, that come from the 4 largest firms. That's what we use to see if a market was an oligopoly. If it's above, I think they say 40%, then it would qualify as an oligopoly. But the drawback is it doesn't count companies from other countries. So you're not getting everyone that's like competing in that market. And also locally, there may be like localized monopolies. Like there's like the bookstore here on campus, it's either them or Amazon for you guys. So even though there may be a lot of different college bookstores across the country, in each market you've got 2 choices. So it's a quick and easy way to say, hey, does this look like an oligopoly or not? But it's not, super accurate.
Thank you. Can you explain the last one? It's about witch trials.
Yeah, ignore that because we didn't do witch trials.
Okay.
Yeah, you just have ordeals and superstition, or gypsy. All right, be able to draw the monopolistic competition curves. The average total cost is hitting a demand curve right there at the equilibrium quantity. Remember, that would be your long run 0 profit, unless the firm is able to innovate again. The one on the right, average total cost is higher than the price times the quantity here, the equilibrium point. So they're earning a loss. So they either need to innovate or get out of that market. And then the one on the left is earning a profit. Average total cost is lower than the demand curve, equilibrium point. I'm not going to have you do like that big market one where they had like the demand and the marginal revenue curve like shifting over and turning like more elastic or more inelastic. Too complicated for what we need to do here. Basic idea is to understand about how monopolistic competition works, how firms innovate, they create these new products or new ways to create the products to meet consumer needs in a different way. Much more realistic than the other types of markets. And what we tend to see in real life. Yeah, firms face a downward sloping demand curve. You want to sell more units, you just cut the price. Downward sloping. Yeah, be able to explain why something like a fast casual restaurant chain is monopolistic competition and not perfect competition. Understand what's the difference between the 2 of those. Because in perfect competition, there's no barriers to entry, there's extremely low barriers to entry. Goods are identical, there's many firms and buyers. In the real world, there's not a lot of industries where the products are exactly the same. There's gonna be some sort of differentiation. That's monopolistic competition. And that's why we'd expect restaurant chains to be like that. They're not going to be exactly the same as every other restaurant. They're going to have some differences. They're going to be doing something that separates them from the rest of the pack. Quiznos had a big thing years ago that they like toasted their subs. That was their differentiating like aspect. Buying a cheap toaster is super easy. Subway bought one. No one went to Quiznos anymore because it wasn't like it was high quality. It was just like, hey, we'll toast your super cheap sub. Somebody's like, we'll toast your super cheap sub too. And they lost their, they lost their advantage. If you go through this and are able to like answer these questions, you will have absolutely no problem on the final. You guys have any other questions for this? All right, if not, feel free to email me.